We'll just wait for Stephen to connect to the audio, and then we'll get underway. Welcome, Stephen. Just letting you know, that we're going to be recording the session. So if you want to keep your camera off, that's absolutely fine. We're at start, Sophie, so we can have enough time. Yep. I'll make sure I'll add people if people keep coming into the waiting room and stuff like that. We'll just wait for Matthew to connect to his audio, and then I'll set you off on your way. Fantastic. So Sophie, over to you.
Brilliant. Sorry, I'm just starting the slideshow again. Brilliant. So thank you ever so much for being here this afternoon. I'm sure you've heard a lot of content today, so I'm grateful to you for being here as well. I'm hoping this will be a really practical session looking at organising a generosity week at your church. So just to give you a quick outline of how the next 40 minutes will go, we'll have a short reflection, which is a reflection that I often use when I go and visit churches and PCCs. So if anyone wants to steal it and use it in their own church context, that's absolutely fine. Anything that you hear or see this afternoon, you're welcome to use and not worry about that at all. I'll then go into the workshop proper. We'll have a section looking at kind of bigger picture, why bother looking at a generosity week at all, and then the second half of the section will be much more practical on the nuts and bolts. I do apologize, I'm in my parents' house and that's their landline ringing, but I'm sure they'll answer it in a second. So yeah, the second half of the section will be much more practical and on the nuts and bolts of how to put a generosity week together. So before we get underway, I thought you might just like to know a little bit about who I am. So my name is Sophie Hodge. You can see that photo in the top left-hand corner is my daughter getting christened just 2 weeks ago. She's 2 years old, and it had taken us that long to navigate COVID lockdowns and family diaries, etc. So you can see there that I'm married to my husband, Jamie, and I have a beautiful little girl called Liza. The bottom right-hand photograph is taken of the Lake District. So that's where I'm fortunate enough to live. I've lived here since 2014. And so if anyone doesn't know the area, that bottom right-hand corner photograph are the sorts of views that we get to enjoy at the weekends. And then again, just sharing a little bit more about me, that middle photo was taken at something we call a mini adventure. So I help lead a group that looks at building faith in a family context. So mainly looking at kind of families with toddlers and babies and how we kind of build faith in that home family context. And that's us on a weekend mini adventure. So that's a little bit about me. I've worked for Carlisle Diocese since 2018, and for the last 2 years we've really looked a lot at generosity weeks and have worked very closely with helping dozens of churches in Carlisle Diocese put on generosity weeks, and they've been really, really powerful and really, really helpful to us. So before I crack on, I just thought it might be helpful for me to share a little bit of the context of Carlisle Diocese. I'm conscious of the fact that we're probably very different as a diocese to Manchester Diocese, but even so, I wonder, as I thought about some of the challenges we face at Carlisle Diocese in terms of looking at generosity and putting on generosity weeks, I wondered whether actually some of the challenges would resonate with you there in Manchester Diocese as well. So our context is we're very, very rural, which is obviously very different to Manchester Diocese, and consequently our churches tend to be very small. So average congregation size in Carlisle Diocese would be about 25. And the reason this has an impact on generosity weeks is actually often when I go and speak to churches, I'm talking to clergy and PCCs who are often just feeling a little bit overstretched, maybe a little bit tired, and actually I'm going there with yet another initiative, and so actually I've just got to be careful of that dynamic when looking at Generosity Week. The next feature challenge in Carlisle Diocese is that many of our congregations are elderly and declining. And so again, this can feed into the whole kind of people feeling a bit overstretched when we talk to them about Generosity Week. At Carlisle Diocese, we operate a parish offer system, and that has really been under strain over the last few years. We've actually over the last 10 years seen a drop of 40% in real terms when it comes to parish offer. So there's quite a lot of strain in the system there. But that said, we've seen an increase in parish offer this year, which is really fantastic. And actually, the diocese and the churches are in a sustainable position, despite the fact that the amount of money we have to work with is a lot less than it used to be. Another challenge we find is that this definitely isn't true in all our churches, but in some of our churches, there is a real nervousness about talking about giving and generosity, particularly if it has a financial dimension. And so sometimes we can encounter a little bit of resistance to that. And then finally, there can just be a bit of a sense of misunderstanding about how churches are funded and where money comes from. So we might not have a clear understanding in our churches of the true costs of ministry. So often in Carlisle Diocese, for example, a cost of a full-time stipendiary vicar is £65,000 a year once you factor in on all the on costs, and you might have a church making a parish offer of £26,000 a year and assuming that they're more or less covering their costs of ministry. We also have a dynamic where people, certainly in the wider community, but often even in the worshipping community, assume that the government pays for our church buildings, or perhaps the national church pays for our vicars' stipends, or even the diocese pays for it, but they don't realise that actually the costs of the church fall on the worshipping community, and so that can be quite a big hurdle to overcome. Okay, so that's enough of a kind of background. We'll just spend a few minutes now looking at this reflection. And the reason I do this often when I speak to churches is because I want to root anything we talk about with Generosity Week and stewardship in actually our faith. It's so easy to get caught up in the kind of the practicalities, the paying our parish share, the balancing the budgets, that it's easy to forget what it's really about. And so I hope that this reflection will just help center us before we start on the nuts and bolts. And so I'll just give us a couple of moments quiet, and while we have those quiet moments, I'll ask you to read through the verses on the screen and just consider if a verse stands out to you. So it might be that a verse really encourages you or inspires you. It might be that a verse feels a bit uncomfortable, but just consider a verse that might stand out to you. And then at the end of the minutes, quiet minutes we have, if anyone wants to share a particular verse that stood out to them, that would be great. But I'll just give you a couple of moments now to read that through. Okay, I'm not sure how long to give people to read. I'm quite a slow reader, but if anyone has a verse that kind of stood out to them and they'd like to share why, that would be lovely to hear. If not, we'll carry on. But if anyone did find a verse stood out to them, feel free to unmute your mic and just share why.
I think that first one, 1 Chronicles 29:14, the last bit where it says everything comes from you and we've given only what comes from your hand. I think that's an important reminder, really, to remember that everything we have is actually from God, and therefore we are only stewards of it, and therefore we should be using it the way, for his purposes, the way he wants us to.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, what a shift in mindset that is for most of us, because in reality we don't necessarily think like that every day, but doesn't it transform generosity if you see yourself as giving only what God has given you as a gift anyway? Yeah, thank you, Stephen. That's really helpful. Anyone else want to share a verse? Lovely. Okay, so I'll divide the next half an hour into two sections. The first section is a bigger picture, kind of why bother running a generosity week in the church, and then the second section will be more the nuts and bolts of putting it together. So for me, this is the most important question to answer when I go and see a church, because as I said before, often they're feeling slightly overstretched. There's a lot going on. They're busy people. Why should they take on something else? Even if you're part of a bigger church, and perhaps our small rural Cumbrian churches, I'm sure you're still very busy. You'll have maybe youth ministry, different things going on. Why look at something else? And really, this is what makes me excited about my job, is that Generosity Week and generosity isn't about being able to pay your parish share. It's not about balancing budgets. It's about something far more fundamental. And that is that generosity is a fundamental part of our Christian discipleship journeys. And actually is therefore something really positive. So when I try and talk to our PCCs about this, I usually use the next few slides. And again, if you want to steal any of this to use in your own church contexts, please feel free. So what I like to talk to churches about is this idea of what is stewardship. So this idea that actually stewardship is based in the character of God. We have an extravagantly generous God, and everything we have is a gift from God. So for me, that would be my beautiful daughter and my husband. It would be the creation. It would be my home. It would be my money. It would be the air I breathe. Everything I have, the food I eat, is a gift from God. Obviously, the ultimate gift from God being Jesus Christ and the promise of eternal life. And then stewardship asks, and what is our response to that? It's to give our whole lives back to God, our time, our talents, and our money. And that's, of course, the call of discipleship. I like to share these three quotes with churches, which can be quite challenging. I find them quite challenging. But perhaps are particularly helpful if you've got a church that feels slightly uncomfortable about the place that giving or talking about giving should play in a church context. So on the left-hand side, Billy Graham says, our checkbooks, bank and credit card statements are theological documents in that they reveal our hearts. Our checkbooks, banks and credit card statements are theological documents in that they reveal our hearts. Martin Luther says there are three conversions: the heart, the head and the wallet, the last being a test of the first two. And Jesus famously says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will also be. So just some helpful quotes to challenge us on the role of giving in our discipleship journeys. So the first reason to look at stewardship in your church and generosity week in your church is because it's an essential part of our discipleship journey. So my hope for your churches is that as you look at generosity week, you're actually growing disciples in your church as well. The second reason to look at generosity week is something that we might feel more familiar with, and that's the idea that generosity enables the mission and ministry of our church. Anyone who sits on a PCC, I'm sure, is very aware of this reality. All the PCCs I've met have been incredibly generous in terms of the time, the expertise and the money that they give to their church. And it's only because of that generosity that the mission and ministry of the church happens. This photo was taken at a messy church that happens in one of our most rural out of the way churches in Cumbria, and yet it's a really thriving messy church that can attract up to 50 families and is really popular. So just a real reminder of how even the smallest churches can have really powerful missions. We ran a generosity week with a church in May, and last week their vicar, Shanthi Thompson, sent me this email just giving some feedback, which was really encouraging, and I thought I'd share with you. Shanthi said, "I'm absolutely delighted to tell you that our monthly giving has increased by nearly £1,000. Against an £11,000 predicted overspend, this is wonderful. I hope other churches take up this scheme as it has helped us enormously. Heating bills will be very high this autumn and winter, but this result means we don't have to hold back on missional activities, which can easily take a back seat when you are worried about bills. This result means we don't have to hold back on missional activities, which can easily take a back seat when you're worried about bills." I just thought that last bit of a sentence really summed up this part of what holding a generosity week is all about. Actually, by looking at generosity and encouraging generosity, we can continue to and increase our investment in mission and ministry activities of your local church. So I find it's helpful to stop often when I'm talking to churches and just take stock of where people are at. Sometimes churches who I think might be a little bit fearful of talking about generosity and running a generosity week are actually really on board and really excited about it. And sometimes people who I assume will be on board have some reservations. So when I'm talking to churches, I often ask them, stewardship is about so much more than balancing the budgets and keeping the church open. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? What does stewardship mean to you? Stewardship is about so much more than balancing the budgets and keeping the church open. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? What does stewardship mean to you? I won't ask us that question, but I will just take a few moments to let you consider some of these bullet points here. So I wondered whether any of the challenges I mentioned at the beginning of the workshop, whether they resonated with you when you thought about your own church context. So is there a sense of people feeling a bit overstretched and maybe struggling to take on extra things? Do you have concerns around parish share and worries about paying parish share? Is that a dynamic in your churches? Do you feel that there's any sense of fear or resistance to talking about giving in your church contexts? And do you feel that there is a good understanding of church finances and where the money comes from and how it's spent? Or perhaps do you see some of the misconceptions in your own churches that I listed before, such as the government paying for church buildings or the national church paying for vicars, or whatever those misconceptions might be? Secondly, what do you think stewardship means to people in your churches? And do you have any questions so far? So you don't have to answer or ask all three of those questions, but I just thought I'd take this moment to pause and see if anyone had any questions or comments related to those bullet points. Give you a break from hearing my voice for a few moments. Feel free to unmute and just speak, or if you want to put something in the chat, that's fine as well.
Hi, I minister in an area that is extremely deprived. And when you talk to people about everything they've got is a gift from God, it's very not the context to be able to speak about that, because most of them don't feel they have anything. Even if you say you've got your children, many are struggling to feed them or to just be with them. Even sometimes some of them have got drug problems, alcohol problems. So talking to people as a gift, to see what gift they've got, all the good gifts, doesn't really work in this area.
It's a trick. No, it's a really helpful comment. We've got an area in Cumbria called Barrow-in-Furness, which is one of the most deprived places in the country. It has I think, sadly, the highest level of drug-related deaths in the country. It is mega deprived.
Is it Cleator? Is it near Cleator?
It's not Cleator Moor, actually, but Cleator Moor would be another example of a very deprived area. Cleator Moor is a more rural deprived area, whereas actually Barrow-in-Furness is our second big urban centre, and it is extremely deprived, and it's actually very cut off as well, which is difficult because it makes job opportunities very difficult there. And we very recently did a generosity week with a church in Barrow-in-Furness, and I wasn't at all sure how it was going to go. And there are some parts of Generosity Week which I would recommend need to be thought about in that sort of context and maybe changed. So, for example, the thrust of a lot of the Generosity Week literature, which I'll come into at the in a moment, is encouraging regular giving via standing orders. And in the Barrow-in-Furness context, that wasn't really appropriate, just because of the way finances work for people like that. But we did a Generosity Week there. We adapted it with the help of the PCC and the vicars to kind of advise us and kind of, because obviously they know their context far better than we did. And I went and preached one of the Sundays and spent the Sunday with them. And it was actually one of the most powerful Generosity Week Sundays I'd spent with the church. So just a little anecdote, like afterwards, we basically ended up, and this has never happened to me before, having a bit of a ministry time with people in the church who just came and shared kind of where they were at, what their struggles were, what had been going on, and kind of where they'd experienced God's generosity and where they were kind of struggling. And I was there with a colleague, and we actually got to pray with quite a few people after the service, which we've never done before, and that was really powerful. And I just mentioned in the service, just as a kind of anecdote, not asking for money at all, but I used as an example a story from a charity that I'm a trustee of, who I've been to visit in Malawi several times, and I wasn't making any kind of ask at all, but at the end of the service someone came and put a £20 note in my hand and said, "That's for your charity." And that's never happened to me before. I've preached at some very affluent churches, I've preached at urban churches, I've preached at rural churches. I've often used this Malawi anecdote, and no one has ever given me a penny towards the charity until I was at that church. And, you know, £20 is actually a lot of money, isn't it? That's not an insignificant amount. And I was really challenged by that. And really, just really, really challenged by that. And so I would say, in that context, and they did actually see an increase in their giving, and I think it was a helpful thing for them to do, but I definitely think it needed the wisdom of the vicar and the PCC to think through how it would work and be perceived in their community, because you can't just take it off the shelf and expect that something that works in one place will also work in another place. Sorry, that was quite a long-winded response to that comment, but it just really impacted me actually that Sunday. It was something
I do find that churches in urban areas are generous in the amount they give to what they've got.
Yeah.
I did a placement in Harrogate, and their percentage of giving was incredibly low in comparison to another church I was at, which was urban priority.
Yeah.
So they do give a lot, but they're not seen as giving a lot because they haven't got a lot to give.
Yeah. And definitely I think you do have to think about the messaging, particularly around the sort of response you're expecting and what is appropriate in that context. Thank you, that's really helpful. Are there any other comments or questions? Okay, we'll crack on with the practicalities. I'm not sure whether most of you have come across Generosity Week before, or whether this is the first time you've come across Generosity Week, but just to say, in terms of a bit of a definition of what Generosity Week is, Generosity Week is a set of resources that have been put together by the National Church that are designed to make stewardship as easy as possible for your church to engage with. Generosity Week is an invitation for your church to spend 8 days being inspired by generosity. The resources allow us to reflect on God's amazing generosity to us and explore how we can grow generosity in our churches. I've just seen the comment from Elizabeth. Thank you for Elizabeth. That's interesting to hear. So in in terms of how Generosity Week is structured, although it's a week, it's 8 days because it starts with a Sunday, and the theme of that Sunday is generosity, and then it also ends on a Sunday, and the theme of that week is gratitude. And I think one of the real strengths of Generosity Week is that National Church have spent a lot of time putting together some really excellent resources. So the resources themselves are really good quality, they're really inspiring, they're really helpful. So it's good quality stuff, but also they've worked hard to try and make it as straightforward for churches as possible. So recognizing that kind of sense that I've had of often churches feel a bit overstretched, these resources make it as easy as possible to engage with generosity and stewardship in a meaningful way. So I feel like it is quite a helpful tool for churches to think about using. Sorry, my clicker's being a bit unpredictable. Okay, so what are the steps to making it happen? Well, before you even pick a week, I would say the first thing to do is to pick your team. So who are the people who are going to work together to make this happen? It could be your whole PCC, it could be a little group within that, so perhaps your vicar and treasurer and a couple of others, but whoever it is, who are your team who are going to make it happen? And then the next thing to think about is, when is it going to happen? So National Church have a set date for their Generosity Week, which coincidentally starts tomorrow. So if you want to tune into their online service tomorrow, you can. But at Carlisle Diocese, we actually say that people can have Generosity Weeks at any point in the year, and the resources work for any point in the year. And we've seen a lot of success with that. So we still have probably the majority of our Generosity Weeks happening around harvest time. Some of them obviously got postponed this year, sadly, because of the Queen's death. But generally, harvest is our busiest time. But Lent has been very popular, and we've seen some really good Generosity Weeks happen during Lent and kind of fit in with that theme well. May is quite popular, I think, because it's a bit quieter in the church calendar maybe, and we've even had some in February which have been successful as well. So I would say it doesn't matter when you hold it, but it's looking for 2 consecutive Sundays which are free, so you can have these 2 themed Sundays next to each other, and obviously at a time that isn't too busy with other things in the church calendar. So these are the resources that I mentioned. So the first thing that's really helpful with Generosity Week are the Sunday morning resources. So the National Church have put together some really good templates for both the Generosity Sunday and the Gratitude Sunday. And they've actually got 3 types of resources. So if you have Eucharistic services every week and you want a Eucharistic template service, they've got those. If you've got a formal service of the words but without Eucharist, they've got those templates. And if you've got a more kind of contemporary and formal style service, then we've got templates for that as well. And these templates, if you want to just keep it really straightforward and as easy as possible for your church, you can just lift them off and use them word for word. And as I say, they're really good quality services, and I think are really helpful. If you want to find those template services, you can either look on the Church of England website. So they've got a section called Building a Generous Church and then Generosity Week, or you can go on the Carlisle Diocese website under Stewardship and Generosity Week, and you'll find them there. And of course, if you just want to use them as a springboard and edit them and adapt them for your own context, that's completely fine as well. And then here at Carlisle Diocese, we actually decided that we wanted to add an extra dimension to the Generosity Week. So the National Church envisaged that initially that Generosity Week wouldn't include a kind of an ask or an annual review, but that would happen separately. In Carlisle Diocese, we felt that it was unlikely that churches would look at stewardship or generosity twice in a year. And so we decided to combine the annual review with the Generosity Week, and that's been really, really effective and has been the reason we've seen churches have quite substantial increases in giving, because you're doing the inspiring discipleship stuff and you're doing the ask at the same time. And so we've put together these resources that we advise go out a few weeks before the Generosity Week, and all of these resources again can be found on our Carlisle Diocese's website under Stewardship and Generosity Week. So the first thing we have is a letter from the vicar. This is really helpful because it's really helpful for the vicar to introduce Generosity Week, explain what's going on and why, to set it in its discipleship context, and to also set it in the kind of vision for the church. So we really encourage you to have a look at that letter and to have something that goes out from the vicar introducing Generosity Week and setting it in that context. We then have a finance leaflet. Now, we talked before about how often the treasurer kind of might really understand the financial context of the church and feel that responsibility, but the wider church might not really understand where money comes from, where it goes, and kind of how the financial health of the church is. The hope is that this finance leaflet is one of the things you can do to try and change that, to try and help all the church understand the financial context and therefore everyone to have a sense of responsibility. So this leaflet, this is obviously just showing the inside pages, but for example, it's showing how you might spend, how the church spends money each week, where the income comes from. This particular church was operating at a £36,000 a year deficit, and they had a £20,000 target for their stewardship program, which meant that they needed to increase giving by £385 a week. But for many people in the church, that would have been the first time that they'd really been told that message in very kind of clear ways. And that bottom table is a gift array. Because we can often be quite private about giving, people often just don't have a clue kind of where to start when they think about giving to the church. So this giving array, which would need to be edited depending on your context, or some of our churches choose not to include it at all, but it just gives a bit of an indication. So for example, if 6 people increase their giving by £2.50 a week, if 13 people increase their giving by £5 a week, etc., then we could meet our target of £385 a week. So this leaflet can actually be found, is taken from the Giving in Grace website, which is a really good website to have a look at. They've got an annual review section, and that's where this leaflet comes from. Or we have a very similar one on our generosity section of the Carlisle Diocese website as well. So either of those can be helpful to use. And then finally, we have a response form. Now, I really encourage you to include a response form, because actually you can have the most inspiring Sunday services, you could have the most amazing preacher, but we're all busy, we all have good intentions, but we don't necessarily have the time to follow through all the time, unless you make it really easy for people. And so this is making it easy for people. It also means if you've got people new to the church or on the fringe of the church, they might not know who the treasurer is, or the treasurer might be on holiday at the time when they want to sort this out. And again, things get delayed and forgotten. Whereas a response form, they can fill it in there and then. There could be a box in church on the 2 weeks of Generosity Week that they can just post it into anonymously. And we feel that we have a far higher response rate when we include a response form than when we don't. Now, you might want to think about what you want on your response form. What is a kind of reasonable response to expect from your church? Often we include, as you can see here, a standing order mandate on the back. If your church was in Barrow-in-Furness, you might decide that that wasn't the response that felt appropriate, and you might have something else on your response form. But we do encourage you to have a response form that people can fill in there and then and know that they've done it. As I said, one of the strengths of Generosity Week is trying to make it simple and easy for churches. So if you want it to be really straightforward, you can hold a very successful Generosity Week and just leave it there with the services and the literature. However, the National Church have put together lots of other resources that are also really excellent. So they've got 8 daily morning prayer services, which are really good, which you can use. On the Carlisle Diocese website, if your church is more into kind of having short videos in the service, 40 Acts of Kindness have got some short, really inspiring videos on generosity, often in quite unlikely settings. So yeah, if you just want to encourage yourself or you want to show them in a service to inspire people, do go on the Carlisle Diocese website and look at those generosity videos, people's stories. There's some house group sessions, there's 8 podcasts, and there's marketing materials. So you don't have to use any of those, but if you want to delve in a bit deeper, those resources are there. And then just finally, before I stop talking, a quick word on the cost of living crisis. We are aware, obviously, that people are facing very real hardship at the moment, and we have been asked whether generosity weeks are appropriate in the context of a cost of living crisis or whether churches should postpone them. Just 3 thoughts on that. One is, for a lot of churches, their costs are increasing a lot at the moment too, and we don't know how long we're going to be in this cost of living crisis, so you just need to balance the kind of long-term impact of the sustainability of your mission and ministry if you do decide to postpone, bearing in mind we don't know how long we'd be postponing for. I do think we need to be particularly concerned about the tone of everything we say on a Sunday morning or write, and we really need to recognise that at this time some people won't be able to respond at all. Some people may actually have to decrease their giving to their churches. And obviously we hope that there will be many people who can increase the giving. But actually, wherever people are on that spectrum, it's important that they continue to feel a really welcome, included, loved, blessed part of the church community. So just making sure that comes through in all of your comms. And we have actually adapted our letter from the vicar since the cost of living crisis to try and reflect that. And then finally, we were just really struck when we looked at biblical examples of generosity, that actually the call to generosity in the Bible was really inclusive, and in fact often celebrated the generosity of people who are most hard pressed. So Jesus famously celebrated the generosity of the widow in the story of the widow's mite, and Paul famously used as a shining example of generosity the Macedonian church in 2 Corinthians 8, who were financially the most hard-pressed of Paul's churches. So we felt the biblical mandate was to be very inclusive, and even to recognise the giving that people made in the most kind of hard-pressed places. And so we felt that it was appropriate to still talk about generosity and do generosity weeks in the cost of living crisis, but actually just to be particularly sensitive at that time. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. I think we've got 3 minutes for questions. So if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question or pop one in the chat, I'll be happy to answer what I can.
If you come up with a question later on, everyone, you can also put it in the section on Hoover where you found the link for this as well. You can ask a question there, and Sophie will keep an eye on that for the next couple of days and shoot you back an answer, I'm sure. So if there's nothing coming to you right now, that's absolutely fine. But if you do have a question, please do not hesitate to ask.
Yeah, are there any stats on the successive previous generosity weeks?
Yeah, so we do an evaluation with churches after every generosity week, and so far every generosity week we've run has resulted in increased giving, which has been really good, often in the region of about 10 to 12%. Now, we have found, and I don't know if this is true of churches in Manchester, that churches did lose often some significant givers in COVID because people moved away or stopped coming or whatever. So quite a few of our churches have seen a dip in giving. So the challenge, when we did this 2 years ago, people were really happy because their income had increased by 15%, and that was fantastic. This year it's been a bit more nuanced because people have lost 10 to 15% of their income, and then this has made it back up. That's something we've seen quite a lot, but it's still 10 to 15% more than they would have had they not done a generosity week. So it has been very worthwhile. We haven't yet had a generosity week that hasn't resulted in an increase in regular giving. And that's often with quite small rural churches, and the bigger the church, generally the stronger the results are. So yeah.
That's brilliant, thank you.
Someone who shared in a mission week with Shanthi in 2018. I assume that's the same Shanthi, which is lovely. She's wonderful. I really like Shanthi.
Well, everyone, that is at the end of our allotted time with Sophie. Thank you so much, Sophie. Thank you, everyone else, for coming. There's still one session to go left. If you want to go and jump on that now as the conference wraps up, then please feel free to. Also, remember that you can access all this stuff online for a week or so afterwards as well. So make sure, I think it might be longer than that. Don't quote me, but you can definitely watch it afterwards.
Until Christmas, I think.
Until Christmas. Oh my word, it's absolutely massive. Yeah, if there's anything you've missed, then please do watch it. But I hope you have a great rest of your day, everyone. And yeah, see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a blessed rest of your day. There you go.
I ended up just removing the last couple.
Oh, you managed to do that. Well done.
Yeah, I was like, well, there's no point. Yeah, they were just waiting here for it. Well done, really good job.
Thank you, Joel. I'm sorry you had to sit through the same talk twice.
No, it's fine. It's all good. It's good content. It's good for me to learn because it'll be good for me to talk to churches about it. So it's useful to.
You could use it in your mission communities.
Oh, I absolutely will be. I will be. Don't worry about that. So
cool.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie.
Well, thanks for your time, Joel. Appreciate
A pleasure.
that.
Have a good evening. You doing anything exciting or not?
Well, I'm actually technically on holiday at the moment. I'm with my family in Dorset.
Right. Yes.
My husband and my mum have just taken my 2-year-old daughter to a theatre thing, which was meant to be for kids, but she's 2 and it was meant to be for 3-year-olds. And apparently she lasted 5 minutes and then they had to leave because she got scared. So I'm not sure what they're doing now.
I've got a 2.5-year-old nephew who called Barney, who's absolute legend. So I can imagine him being quite similar.
Well, she's actually quite a bold child usually. She's pretty outgoing, but she's not done anything like this before, so it was obviously a bit too much for her.
COVID babies are really, it's going to take a bit of time for them to rebuild that. I think there wasn't a lot of that for the first year and a bit. Barney was born in May of 2020, so it was a very weird time.
Yeah, well, Liza was July of 2020, so it was really odd time, but yeah.
Well, have fun.
Thanks, Joel. Take care.
Nice
to meet you. Bye.
Nice to meet you. Bye bye.